The energy business is one of the largest industries in the world. Major fossil fuel companies make billion-dollar profits, as you know, extracting and distributing oil, gas, and coal. And unfortunately, fossil fuels produce carbon dioxide, CO2. And when it is burned, CO2 is the main driver of the climate crisis. At World Without Genocide, we no longer call it climate change or global warming. We are well beyond that. It is a climate crisis. And that's my topic this morning. At the UN General Assembly's September meeting last week, Trump called the climate crisis the greatest con job ever perpetuated, I think he meant perpetrated, made by stupid people, unquote. And a report finds that the Republican spending bill will grant $40 billion in additional subsidies to the oil and gas industry over the next decade. The administration has already added nearly $40 billion in new federal subsidies for oil, gas, and coal in 2025, sending an additional $4 billion out the door each year for fossil fuels over the next decade. And that new amount, created with the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in the summer of 2025, adds to $30.8 billion a year in pre-existing subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. The report finds that the amount of public money that the US will now spend on domestic fossil fuels stands at least at $34.8 billion a year. The US has been subsidizing fossil fuel production for more than a century. Many of the tax subsidies have been on the books for decades. The Union of Concerned Scientists states that instead of acknowledging the harmful effects of their products and committing to reducing polluting emissions, the world's largest fossil fuel companies have knowingly deceived the public about climate science and policy, and they continue to do so. More than 50 years ago, scientists at major fossil fuel companies considered how climate changes could factor into decisions about new fossil fuel extraction. Their concerns echoed the latest science of the time, which showed a clear link between fossil fuels and the warming that was occurring on the planet. Oops, not yet. But corporate decision makers didn't listen. Instead, they downplayed and they distorted the evidence of climate changes. Industry trade groups and associations continued to spread disinformation about the crisis, while corporate lobbyists influence politicians and regulators, all with the financial backing and support of the fossil fuel companies. So what we see are some of these enormous amounts. $40 billion in fossil fuel subsidies. $4 billion a year. $30.8 billion already. $34.8 billion annually. And as you see, the Union of Concerned Scientists is very clear about documenting the corporate misinformation that has come forward, that the fossil fuel companies have knowingly deceived the public about the realities of what is occurring. $445 million is the estimated spending by the fossil fuel industry in the 2024 election. That's an enormous sum, of course, and it includes direct donations, lobbying, and advertising. That $445 million was only for 1 year, for the past election in 2024. So where are we headed? $2.9 billion is being spent on advocacy advertising alone in the 10-year period that ended in 2015. 1.3 billion more was spent lobbying to shape public policy on energy issues during that same period. $827.9 million has been spent in direct campaign contributions since 2000 to elect sympathetic officials at local, state, and federal levels. Exxon and other oil companies have spent more than $5 billion undermining climate science and fighting clean energy policy. These numbers are truly astounding. And the word that is being given to it is a word that I truly find challenging for all of us. And that is that we are living within an oligarchy, individuals and corporations that are spending billions of dollars to support the fossil fuel industry. So my goal with our time together this morning is to speak about the role of the US government presently in politicizing and denying human responsibility for the climate crisis. I'll speak about the current administration's efforts to dismantle all existing methods to prevent, to mitigate, and to respond to climate disasters. And I'll address the White House goal to prevent federal and state lawsuits that would hold climate polluters responsible for trillions of dollars of damage. I'll conclude with positive state and individual actions to address the consequences of this crisis. The scope of the climate crisis in the US is almost unfathomable. In 2024 alone, in the US alone, there were 27 episodes of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, with a total cost, as you see, of $182.7 billion. This was only in 2024. These events included severe storms, tropical cyclones, droughts, and wildfires. If we add the 2024 events to the existing record since 1980, the United States, only the United States, has experienced 403 such disasters, and the cumulative costs exceed $2.9 trillion. $2.9 trillion. If we look at a map of 2024 billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, it breaks down into 32 drought events, 45 flooding events, 9 freeze events, 203 severe storms, 67 tropical cyclones, 23 wildfire events, and 24 severe winter storm events. In the period 1980 to 2024, the annual average of severe events, such as those I'm speaking about, was 9 events every year. If, however, we consider the last 5 years, we are up to 23 events a year. Since 1980, at least 16,941 people are known to have perished as a direct result of these tragedies. I always like to share political cartoons, and I think this one perhaps sums up where we are quite nicely. Almost every scientist in the world agrees that we are in a crisis situation. Those who are denying are ignoring the truth of what is occurring. In a recent article in Scientific Reports, the authors do estimate that up to a fourth of Americans still don't believe that there is a climate crisis. This denialism is highest in our country, in the central and southern part of our states, but it even persists in clusters within states, even states such as California, where belief in the crisis is high. And why does this occur? Reasons for ongoing denialism are multifaceted. One of those reasons is political affiliation and ideology. Another is income, education, mistrust in science, geographic location, with people in rural areas being more inclined to deny the impact. People who have exposure to extreme weather events are also far more likely to accept the horror that we are encountering on an almost daily basis. Denialism is also more prevalent where local economies are highly dependent on fossil fuels. So we have to be mindful of that link, that very strong economic connection. That report in Scientific Reports reveals how a coordinated social media network will use periodic events, such as cold weather and climate conferences, to spread disbelief about the climate crisis and about science in general. And the authors of that report analyzed 7.3 million social media posts. What they found was that messaging from Trump happens to be the strongest influence in social media networks, followed by conservative media outlets and right-wing activists. And we know that this is no surprise. Combating misinformation, however, requires very difficult and challenging refutation strategies. And employing such strategies on social media sites, for example, on X, is very challenging because denier and believer communities remain isolated from one another. We exist in echo chambers, speaking only to our fellow believers of whatever those beliefs might be. Believers in the crisis, advocates for accurate scientific information, truly have very limited ability to reach deniers through the medium of social media platforms. Climate denialism is a risk in the form of knowledge vulnerability. Those who claim the climate crisis is a natural rather than a human-induced process underestimate their own current and future risk to it, and it makes them less likely to take necessary steps to both adapt to crises and to consider efforts to mitigate them. The Center for Countering Digital Hate conducted an extensive analysis of YouTube videos. The organization evaluated more than 12,000 YouTube videos from 96 different channels that featured climate denial content. The videos were published online from January 2018 through September 2023, so a 5-year period. And in reviewing over 5 years of videos, arguments suggesting that the idea that global warming isn't happening at all actually did drop by over 34%. There is a new refrain. Trends over the past year indicate that those voices that deny the crisis have settled instead on focusing on skepticism about climate solutions, about the scientists, and about the effectiveness of advocates. They are focusing on skepticism that the crisis will cause harm that is indeed irreparable. Another response is skepticism that even though the crisis is truly devastating, that it's too awful and nothing can be done to prevent, mitigate, and repair. So many climate skeptics are shifting the ideological fight to how seriously humanity must take the crisis or what ought to be done about it. The YouTube researchers suggest further that the content policies of YouTube's parent company, which you know is Google, are ineffective and should be updated. And this is a very serious issue to contemplate. The policies are supposed to block advertising money from content that rejects scientific consensus about the crisis and the causes of what is occurring, but it has not done that. Back in October 2021, Google promised to stop placing ads alongside denial content so that purveyors of the false claims could no longer make money on its platforms, including directly on YouTube. But YouTube is continuing to profit from videos that portray the changing climate as a hoax or as an exaggeration. Researchers in this sphere working on these issues found 100 videos viewed at least 18 million times in total that violated Google's own policies. They found videos accompanied with major ads from Adobe, Costco, Calvin Klein, and Politico. Even an ad for Google's search engine popped up before a video that was claiming that there was no scientific consensus about the changing climate. So it is becoming increasingly obvious and increasingly apparent that something must be done to address the impact of I call it anti-social media in this sphere. Scientists who study Earth systems have agreed for decades and decades that the human burning of fossil fuels creates an imbalance of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, and these gases are warming the world. And you know, I'm sure, from this course, that the Earth has warmed by roughly 1.2 degrees Celsius since before industrial times, when fossil fuels began to drive all of our economies. The warming is melting the ice shelves, causing sea level rise and intensifying the water cycle. Scientists have directly connected individual events, like the killer heat waves called the heat dome in 2021 in the Pacific Northwest, to human-caused climate change. While denialism of various sorts continues unabated, accountability for the climate crisis has moved forward to the state level in the US. Over the past decade, some 36 states and local governments have sued the biggest oil companies in the world, arguing that the industry hid what it knew about the dangers of the global change. Fossil fuel companies consider these lawsuits a major threat, on a scale of the tobacco industry settlement a quarter of a century ago. That settlement held cigarette makers financially responsible for the health consequences of smoking that impacted generations of people. And we know that this was led by organizations in the state of Minnesota. This major suit was initiated in Minnesota. In the Master Settlement Agreement in 1998, major tobacco companies agreed to pay $206 billion over 25 years to states. Additionally, there were other settlements and lawsuits, many of which resulted in millions of dollars. And now it could indeed happen to the fossil fuel industry. However, the campaign to stop these oil lawsuits is heating up. Trump has declared the lawsuits a threat to the American economy. He calls them ideologically motivated obstacles to his goal of U.S. energy dominance. And I want to be clear that I am not calling to task the administration for partisan actions. These are actions that ultimately redound to what has been determined to be a human right to a clean environment. World Without Genocide is a human rights organization. That is our pathway, that is our mission, that is our framework for these efforts. We are a 501c3 and avowedly nonpartisan organization, but with a commitment to defend human rights. The current Justice Department has taken the aggressive step of suing two states directly, New York and Vermont, on May 1st, 2025, to try to prevent them from even filing lawsuits against Exxon and other similar companies. The administration is suing these states over their climate superfund laws, as they are called, which would impose financial liability for past emissions on these perpetrating companies. The financial awards would fund climate adaptation project. And what we know is that these lawsuits are saying that they are violating due process, they are violating interstate and foreign commerce clauses, and they are infringing on the federal government's authority over foreign affairs. The lawsuits are accusing the states of not adhering to these particular perspectives that the Justice Department is calling out. Trump had issued an executive order the previous month ordering the United States Attorney General to halt state laws that burden energy production. Minnesota is likely to introduce a bill in the 2026 legislative session akin to these two bills in Vermont and in New York. The goal will be to hold climate destroyers to financial accountability. Environmentalists fear that the industry will hash back again past efforts to lobby for a federal immunity provision, for which there is indeed precedent. And the precedent comes from the gun lobby. In 2005, a shield law was passed that protects gun makers from liability when their products are used in crimes. It is called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, referred to as the PLCAA. And this provides broad immunity from lawsuits for gun manufacturers, distributors, dealers, and importers for damages resulting from the misuse of their products. This shield law, as it is known, protects them from most civil liability claims arising from the unlawful use of firearms. The climate superfund lawsuits are beginning to have increasing importance as states and cities are facing exorbitant costs from flooding, from wildfires, and from other disasters. Litigation is one of the few remaining ways to bolster their budgets and to stop the escalating costs that redound to all of us as taxpayers who foot the bill for these climate disasters. And to allow legislation for litigation becomes a critical first step. I want to quote Governor Josh Green of Hawaii. "The climate crisis is here," he said, "and the costs of surviving it are rising every day." And he made that statement as he announced that Hawaii, which suffered grievously last year, would join in the parade of lawsuits. He went on to say, and I quote, "The burden should fall on those who deceived and failed to warn consumers about the climate dangers lurking in their products." His remarks were notable, given that just hours before he made them, on April 30th, 2025, the Justice Department, in a major escalation, had sued his state and also Michigan preemptively to try to prevent them from filing Superfund bills. Pamela Bondi, the United States Attorney General, calls the lawsuits a threat to national security, and I quote her words, "illegitimate impediments to the production of affordable, reliable energy that Americans deserve." The state of Michigan, like Hawaii, will proceed with its lawsuit against fossil fuel actors. But the Justice Department's actions could deter other states and municipalities from filing, or even sway those who have sued to abandon their cases. In fact, a day after Attorney General Bondi's announcement, Puerto Rico dropped its pending case, and a spokeswoman for Governor Jennifer Gonzalez Colon of Puerto Rico said that the suit had been filed by a previous administration and that the acting governor, the sitting governor, was committed, and I quote, "to a pro-growth energy agenda." We know that states are threatened with financial withdrawals of federal funding should policies be deemed incompatible with various federal procedures and goals. The oil companies and their allies argue that the litigation is an attempt by state officials to wrest power over energy policy away from the federal government. Supporters of efforts to hold fossil fuel companies responsible say that the cases are a step towards accountability. And that report that I referenced by the Union of Concerned Scientists that detailed decades of oil company cover-up said, quote, "Without intervention, these companies will continue their deception, delaying the urgent action needed to mitigate further climate destruction." Both arguments have gotten mixed receptions from courts. Many cases have spent years bogged down in debate about whether they should proceed in state courts, where they were filed, or be moved to federal courts, where the oil companies anticipate that big oil would win. Two recent attempts to get the Supreme Court to review the cases have failed. The claims in the 36 or so existing lawsuits vary, but generally they include allegations like violations of consumer protection laws and deception. None have concluded yet. Some cases have been dismissed by judges and by municipal governments, and some of these cases, although concluded at one level, are now in the appeal stage. Some cases, though, are advancing. Recently, the State Supreme Court of Colorado affirmed a lower court's decision that a case brought by the city and county of Boulder and the county of San Miguel against ExxonMobil and Suncor, a Canadian company, can proceed in a state court. The lawsuit outlines the costly climate hazards the state faces, including, not surprisingly, droughts, floods, and wildfires. An Exxon spokesperson called the case meritless and said it has no place before a state court, and Suncor did not respond. When the Trump administration declared it will disregard the economic cost of the climate crisis as it sets policies and regulations, it was just the latest step in a multi-pronged effort to erase the crisis from the American agenda. But it's doing more than turning a blind eye to the fact that the planet is growing hotter. The administration is weakening the country's capacity to fully understand the warming that is occurring and to prepare for the consequences. And I want to briefly outline some of the actions that have occurred in recent months. Climate research has been dismantled, as we know, firing some of the nation's top scientists and gutting efforts that chart how fast greenhouse gases are building up in the atmosphere and what this means for the economy, for employment, for agriculture, for health, and for other aspects of American society. The government will no longer track major sources of greenhouse gases. This is data that has been measured and identified for the past 15 years. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins told Fox Business on May 8th, and I quote, "We're not doing that climate change, crud anymore," unquote. By getting rid of data, the administration is trying to halt the national discussion about how to deal with this crisis, said Daniel Swain, a climate scientist at UCLA. And I quote his words, "The notion of there being any shared factual reality just seems to be completely out the window." At the same time, through cuts to the National Weather Service and by denying disaster relief through FEMA, the administration has weakened the country's ability to prepare for and to recover from hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and other extreme weather that is becoming increasingly destructive. The administration is also loosening restrictions on air pollution, which experts say will lead to more warming and will overturn the legal authority for government to regulate these gases. And taken together, these moves will leave the residents and leaders of the United States, the world's biggest economy, less informed, less prepared, more polluted, and for us as individuals, much more at risk for our health, for our safety, and with the food that we eat. The administration dismisses, of course, these threats, saying rising seas would create more oceanfront property, and blame is being placed on people who are being labeled as climate lunatics for environmental regulations that the administration says are a drag on the U.S. economy. But let's look at U.S. production. On the first day in office, Trump declared a national energy emergency, something that experts are disputing. And as you see, the United States produces more oil than any country in history and is the world's largest exporter of natural gas. The administration cites the labeling of this national energy emergency as justification for speeding approvals for oil, gas, and coal projects and for expanding logging in national forests. Some agree that reforms are indeed overdue. It's complex to get permits to build pipelines, transmission lines, and for drilling projects. But this has also meant that there also have been significant delays for wind farms, for solar projects, and for other clean energy efforts, according to Robert Stavins, a professor of energy at Harvard. Permitting as a whole in the US, he says, is just a mess. But he goes on to say that the president has gone further than trying to speed up permitting. He's made the American government a global outlier in its denial of science. The senior policy director with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Confirmed Scientists has said, and I quote, "It's as if we're in the dark ages." Their words, not mine. At the most basic level, the administration is dismantling the government's ability to monitor the rapidly changing climate. Hundreds of scientists who've been working on the National Climate Assessment, a report that's been mandated by Congress, those people have been dismissed. More than 500 people have left NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. NOAA also stopped, on orders of the administration's monthly briefing calls on climate issues, and the budget eliminates funding for the agency's climate research. We know that in the past 10 days, certain additional words have now been purged from government websites, words including climate science and climate crisis. Presumably, if those words are purged, those issues disappear. The so-called Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, proposes closing the Hawaii Observatory that has been monitoring greenhouse gas levels since 1958. And the data from that Hawaii Observatory creates what is called the Keeling curve, a graph that shows the sharp rise in carbon dioxide concentrations. The data from Hawaii and other NOAA monitoring stations have been shared with scientists around the globe. The administration is reducing, as we know, the FEMA response. The federal government's response dates back to 1803. By shifting it to states, it is making communities unable to respond adequately. And what we see is that it's being run currently by an administrator who previously has not handled emergency administration. This map is really quite compelling, looking at where it is likely that FEMA cuts will hit the hardest. And we need to be mindful of the fact that many states are utterly ill-equipped for responding to the kind of damage. FEMA at the federal level has denied requests for assistance from Arkansas, where March tornadoes were followed by a second round of destructive weather. Requests from West Virginia, extensive flooding in February, Washington State, battered by windstorms, and North Carolina, still trying to recover from Hurricane Helene, which damaged over 1,000 homes last year. The EPA is being overhauled to end its functions of measuring and controlling greenhouse gas emissions, shredding the staff and the budget, and revoking its two most powerful climate regulations, limits on pollution from tailpipes and from smokestacks. The president has said that relaxing limits on pollution from automobiles, quote, won't mean a damn bit of difference to the environment, unquote. But transportation is the largest single source of greenhouse gases generated by the US, and its pollution is directly linked to asthma, heart disease, other health problems, and premature death. Two major chemical industry trade groups have asked the EPA for a complete exemption from limits on hazardous pollution. But the chief executive of the American Lung Association has said, quote, rolling back these regulations will have a catastrophic effect on health in America. The budget calls for eliminating funding for what the administration derisively is calling the Green New Scam, including cutting $15 billion at the Energy Department for clean energy projects and $80 million at the Interior Department. We know that the administration is particularly hostile towards wind power, but that has recently been given the go-ahead by the courts to complete a project that was halted. Republicans in Congress repealed billions of dollars in tax incentives for production and sales of solar panels, batteries, and other clean energy technologies. Let's consider electric vehicles. These are the steps according to this past week's Economist magazine. The US has scrapped tax credits for electric vehicles, halted charging programs, reversed efforts to build domestic supply chains, dismantled regulatory incentives to drive electrification, gutted fuel economy standards and greenhouse gas rules, and revoked California's authority to set its own targets, despite 40% of US car sales having opted into these rules, from this past week's Economist. It's very difficult for me to keep up with all of what is happening, but just a few days ago, the Interior Department announced that it will open 13.1 million acres of federal land for coal mining. And the phrase that's being used is mine, baby, mine. There are communities throughout the United States that have had federal climate funds withdrawn from their community economic initiatives, as you see in this map, with the amount of economic development money being taken away, that is truly going to represent significant damage in those local economies. What's happening on a global scale? The US retreat from climate action has made the US a global outlier. Nearly every other government recognizes that a hotter planet poses a profound threat to humans and to ecosystems. The US is the only nation to formally withdraw, not once, but twice, from the 2015 Paris Agreement to limit planetary warming. And this means that the US absence puts a greater burden on other countries to take action. As the EU Climate Commissioner said, so forget all the lingo about saving the planet. This is an economic reality that we need to face. The future will be decarbonized, and companies will not survive in the longer run without change. Trump has also withdrawn from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. World Without Genocide has special consultative status with the United Nations. And in that role, we are strong supporters of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is a global initiative that was adopted in 2015 as a universal call to action, and it includes protecting the planet. The US also withdrew from the board for the Fund for Responding at a Global Level to Loss and Damage. Brazil's environment minister, who will host this year's COP Conference of the Parties, the annual conference on the climate crisis, said that the US withdrawal from the global stage leads to what the minister called civilization doom. All other countries will have to take extraordinary steps to meet climate goals. Around the world, countries are racing to adapt to a rapidly warming planet in their efforts to reduce pollution and to build clean energy. And most notable, of course, is China. China's strategic decision to adopt clean energy and to sell it abroad is leading that country to dominating the global markets for electric vehicles, for solar panels, and for other technologies. Even Saudi Arabia, the second largest producer of oil after the US, is spending heavily on wind and solar projects. In the absence today of federal action in our country to halt the progression of the crisis, it is falling to city and state actors to step in and to step up. State action on climate crisis prevention includes setting ambitious emissions reduction targets, developing climate action plans, producing clean energy adoption, and implementing policies to enhance resilience to climate impacts. States are also increasingly collaborating through initiatives like the U.S. Climate Alliance to accelerate climate action. States can accelerate climate action when federal leadership is lacking through tailored solutions. States can tailor their specific climate action plans to their unique circumstances, having to do with their own geographic and their own resource-rich challenges that they face. States can serve as laboratories for testing new policies and new technologies. State-level action can help build public support and engagement in climate action. And I want to highlight what's happening in Minnesota. In 2007, Minnesota passed the Next Generation Climate Act, which required Minnesota to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% between 2005 and 2050, while still maintaining reliable and affordable energy. At the time, Minnesota was ranked the #2 state in the United States, second only to California, for passing aggressive reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. In 2023, the Minnesota state legislature updated these goals to reflect the state's climate action framework. Minnesota's current goals are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 from the 2005 baseline and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. However, the current federal pushback against state efforts may affect these goals and activities, and it remains up to civil society, to universities, to NGOs, to organizations throughout the state to insist and indeed to persist in bold action. 24 states, plus the District of Columbia, have adopted specific greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. 24 states in the United States. And I want to share a specific initiative in the state of Minnesota. To date, to my knowledge, Minnesota is the only state that has taken this step. In Minnesota, we are very proud that the Minnesota State Senate designated April as Ecocide Awareness and Prevention Month. Ecocide is a crime that is moving forward in the International Criminal Court that will make the destruction of the planet on a par with the crimes of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Ecocide as a crime was introduced at the International Criminal Court on December 4th, 2024, in The Hague, the Netherlands, where that court sits. And I was in that auditorium when that bold move was taken to thunderous applause. It is only a matter of time before sufficient states will ratify that new crime. And this is happening all around the world. We encourage people from other states to take this step at the state level that Minnesota has done, to call out ecocide, defined as the widespread and wanton destruction of the environment. Ecocide now is a crime recognized by the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the European Union, and then in domestic statutes of 14 nations around the world. Yet because of the politics in the United States, it is a word that is rarely even heard in the United States. So I say that word to us today, ecocide. I urge all of you to consider your support at an individual level, because we all have the power of one. Things that all of us can do about the climate crisis and about climate injustice. Consider greening your commute, consuming less, wasting less, supporting Indigenous-led climate action, investing in renewables, divesting from fossil fuels, supporting people who are running for election on platforms that support that action. Eat for a climate-stable planet. Mobilize for local climate action. And get politically involved on these issues. The climate crisis is a force multiplier of violence and of social unrest and social injustice. We have no planet B. This is our shared planetary home. It is our responsibility to end impunity for environmental destruction for today and for the future. The time is now. The time is always now. And I thank you for being a wonderful audience today. Please feel free to reach out if you wish to connect with me directly at kennedy@worldwithoutgenocide.org. Consider viewing information about the climate crisis on our website at worldwithoutgenocide.org.